Episode 3, Steven Spielberg. Now, this is going to be not far-fetched one. About 50 years ago, my dad would do odd jobs at various bars around Framingham area. Natick, Framingham. Well, there wasn't any bars in Natick at the time. So there were 74. Well, there was the Moose Lodge, but we don't talk about that. Anyways, he said he picks me up for visitation. This, I think it was like a Saturday morning. And he says he's got to go to see his boss and get paid for some work he did. So we go to Beefsteak Charlies, and I'm stuck in the lobby. And after a few minutes, this guy comes walking over to me. Now, there's the only people here are like servers and stuff setting up the tables for the lunch or whatever. I would assume it was lunch because you're not setting up for dinner at 11 a.m. And we're just standing in the lobby, and he comes over and he starts talking to me about this. He tells me he's making this movie about a shark, and he's having this problem with the scene. There's a girl's hand laying on the beach in seaweed, and the crabs won't move because it's March, April, whatever it was, 74. It's cold, and I said, well, did you try heat lamps? He says, yeah, I tried heat lamps. We did a bunch of stuff. Finally, after several things that he said he'd already tried and didn't work, I said, well, maybe coffee. Coffee's supposed to wake you up, right? 8 years old. So we spent about 20 or so minutes talking about this movie and different things. At one point, he asked me, he said, do you think the boat's going to be big enough? I said, well, how big's the boat? And he tells me whatever number it was, 24 feet or something like that. And I look into the dining room in front of me and look into the dining room behind me, and I said, and how big's the shark? And he's like, well, blah, blah, blah. And I said, I think you're going to need a bigger boat. And he liked that. At one point, I asked him, I said, does the shark have a name? You know, the mechanical one. And he said, I don't think so. I said, well, crews usually, everything gets a name. You're working with it a lot, and you got to call it something, not just shark, because you have multiple sharks. So I said, how about Bruce? Because Bruce just blanked on his name. Schwegler, Bruce Schwegler, was the weatherman in Channel 4 in Boston, and he was marrying my school guidance counselor. So, yeah. So his name popped up. I liked him. He had a good personality on TV, anyways. I never met him in person, but so it ended up being the shark's name. And I remember telling him at one point, because he said they were using nurse sharks, real nurse sharks, and they kept them in a pen out in the ocean. I said, well, you got to be careful. I think one of them's going to escape, and one did. And then there was this other little the cup and the can. When Quint crushes the can, and the Doc crushes the cup. I said that's what would happen in reality. And he liked that. Now, over the next, 3.5 years, I remember other conversations about, okay, I didn't finish the story. Go back. So we finished talking about that, and I'm like, well, it sounds like a good movie, but I don't think it would really appeal to 8-year-olds. I said, how about Cowboys in Space? And I described this energy that traveled through the universe, and good against evil, and a couple scenes like the bar scene with lots of aliens, because I didn't like Star Trek didn't have aliens. They were all humans. So Star Wars needed aliens. And a bunch of other stuff, the kiss scene with Luke and Leia and stuff like that. A trilogy and a trilogy to make it more complicated, start in the middle. And when I wrapped it up, he's like, oh, that sounds really good, but I can't do it. Maybe my friend can. And I'm like, okay. So then just for the next few years, he's arguing with George about how much of a blockbuster this movie's going to be while he's making Close Encounters. And George is like, no, you're making the blockbuster, and blah, 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 blah. But anyways, somewhere along the line, I had conversations before Close Encounters and E.T., years before E.T., that I remember distinct, adding points about how do you communicate with aliens, I was asked. And I said, well, lights and sound, they're pretty common through the universe. It's, every star is light, and there's waves and sound everywhere. Except in space, where they can't hear you scream, allegedly. Anyways, and a few other things, hither and thither, and E.T. with, he can't have all these powers, but he needs to have something really special for the end. One dramatic thing, the Bond one is one thing, but the flying thing, just don't overdo it. and use real products for adding it more realistic. I know you have all these. There are specific brands just for TVs and movies, like cigarettes and beers that you would never see in the store until someone says, "Well, everyone likes that brand because they see it on TV all the time, so we're going to make it real." But anyways, and then there was another conversation about Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, and I'm like, I was a stickler even back then, and remember this a few years after I wrote and produced my first play when I was 6. So, stickler for continuity. And I said, well, if he's going to be an adventure, he's got to have one of those hats. And you can't have it moving and falling off and stuff during different shots. And so it's on, it's off, and different camera angles. So I said, maybe you need to staple it to his head. And I said, and he's going to have to fall in somewhere, and there's going to be snakes that he doesn't like. For safety reasons, I would use a glass partition between him and the snake, so he can get as close as he can to them without, needing to worry about them cobras or whatever biting him. And so, these things were actually done in the movie. Unfortunately, someone missed something in post, and you can see the reflection of Harrison in the glass when he falls in front of the snakes. But he did staple the hat to his head, and I was sort of half joking about that, but he did it. So there's that. And the end of the movie where the warehouse, that was my idea. The way you kept pulling back and it just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So that was like 4 Spielberg movies. And the creation of the trilogy, which was also the trilogy of the trilogy, which was I don't know that number in that term, like when 9 things are together. But that happened. So those are my Steven Spielberg stories. Now, I really wish he could come forward now, because now my dad walked down the stairs after I was done talking to him the first time at the Beefsteak Charlies, and he grumps, he's in a bad mood, whatever, he didn't like whatever happened upstairs, and he grabs me and just drags me outside and tells me not to trust him. Instead of being a good father who would have said, why is this strange man talking to my son, and who are you, and what are you doing? And he seemed to know who he was because he'd obviously been there before when Steve came to see the owner. And obviously Steve could easily go upstairs and say, who was that? And what's his son's name and something. So there would be this connection up for the next few years. I'm not claiming all this other stuff, but I did influence a few things when I was a kid. So that was the beginning. 8 to 22 was my primary things. And we started with Spielberg. We ended around Tim Burton, which was the first episode. And then the post, as I explained in the second episode, was different. And we got many more things to go. As best I can remember, because I can't remember where all the conversations happened. Can't even understand where a couple of them could have happened. For certain years The 80s, when we get into the 80s, and Zemekis and Frank Mancuso Jr. and blah, 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 blah. Things will grow as best I can. And there were some musical things along the way, too. Anyways, this was episode 3. Have a good night.